Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second lecture on dietary supplements and over-the-counter drugs. So this is a topic that conveniently splits into two subsections. Last time we talked about dietary supplements. This time we'll talk about over-the-counter drugs. But in both cases, we'll talk about the regulation of these compounds, how they work when it's known, and what the pros and cons are. And this is true for over-the-counter drugs, just as it is for dietary supplements. So in this session, we'll focus on over-the-counter drugs. First, defining what they are. So what makes something a candidate for an over-the-counter medication as opposed to a prescription-based medication. We'll look at the history of regulation of over-the-counter drugs, and the regulations continue to change. And then we'll look at some examples, the most commonly used over-the-counter drugs. There are lots of them, as any trip to a pharmacy can show you. But there are some very commonly used over-the-counter drugs, and we'll go over those. So first, what are over-the-counter or OTC drugs? So they're drugs, first of all. So they're not supplements. And of course, the big distinction there is that the drugs are designed to remedy or treat a certain disease or condition, which is a claim that you can't make for a dietary supplement. They're also self-administered. They're not prescribed, so that's the other category that distinguishes over-the-counter drugs. They're not dietary supplements, but they're also not prescription medications. So the consumer themselves acquires, purchases, and consumes the over-the-counter drug. And of course, this is a big industry. There are lots of different conditions for which one can get a over-the-counter drug. So pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money, many billions of dollars, from over-the-counter drugs. So why are particular drugs sold over-the-counter, whereas others have to be acquired through a prescription from a doctor? So usually, one of the biggest criteria is the difficulty of overdose. So you have to have a wide therapeutic range. That is, the dosage it takes to have the relief of symptoms or to have some of the desired effect is much smaller than the dose it would take to do harm. If there is the risk of overdose or taking too much and suffering harmful effects from a drug, that's when a doctor needs to prescribe the dosage based on the patient. Also, OTC drugs are supposed to have a low risk for abuse, which is not to say that they aren't abused at all, but they're not nearly as at risk for dependence as something like amphetamines or cocaine or certain depressants like the benzodiazepines, certainly the barbiturates. Anyway, the OTC products tend to have a low risk for abuse, and in fact, usually the only abusers of these drugs are adolescents. That's the tendency. It's not, of course, not a hard and fast rule. Now, they also have to be easy to administer, so you can't have an injectable over-the-counter drug, primarily because that opens up the company to a lot of liability issues. And second, just the average person isn't trained to administer drugs other than ingestion, and methods other than ingesting them. Recently, about 10 years ago, there was an amendment to the Patriot Act that created a new category that is what we call behind the counter. So it still doesn't require a prescription, but you have to present identification, and you can only purchase so much at a time. And this was primarily directed at the compound pseudoephedrine, which was found in a lot of decongestants and cold medications. And that compound by itself is not dangerous and not prone for dependence, but it is a chemical precursor that can be used to create methamphetamines. So this was a measure directed not at diminishing abuse of pseudoephedrine, but at reducing the producers of methamphetamine, reducing their capacity to make the drug. Okay, so when it comes to regulation, of course, there is the Food and Drug Administration, which was established in 1906. We talked about that last time. And of course, we talked about that several weeks ago in our unit on drugs and drug regulation. And originally, the FDA was primarily concerned with the purity and the safety of these drugs. And this is also true for the patent medicines in the early 1900s. Uh, and of course, the dietary supplements sort of went down a separate path where they were only really concerned with purity and safety and not efficacy. But of course, eventually, legislation was advanced uh, so that the FDA had a little more oversight in terms of the efficacy of these compounds. So the FDA is responsible for evaluating uh, the safety and effectiveness of various drugs that are before they're brought to market. Uh, and as a way of tackling this problem, first, the FDA classifies products mainly based on what they are designed to treat. So it is a cough and cold medicine, or it is a sleep aid. Uh, so that classification is the first step. And then there are just hundreds of thousands of different drugs um, in terms of packaging, marketing, the technical individual products. But of course, a lot of these products have overlapping ingredient lists. Some have the exact same ingredients, they're just marketed by different companies. But many of them might change a little bit in terms of flavoring or coloring, uh, or the binder that holds the pill together. But their active ingredient is the same. And the FDA's simplified their own task by only really focusing on the active ingredients. So if 10 different products have the same active ingredient, then the FDA can evaluate that one ingredient and say that all of these products are safe because the only psychoactive or physiologically active component is the one ingredient they care about. So that was a way that the FDA made its task a bit simpler. So there are some phrases that get used with regard to the FDA and their evaluations. One is generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. And this means that there are relatively few adverse reactions. So not many people suffer an adverse reaction. That's one of the criteria for GRAS. The other is that side effects might be common, but they have to be pretty mild. So you have to have basically very infrequent, very negative occurrences, or you have relatively mild side effects for a larger group. So both those have to be true. And again, to be generally recognized as safe, there has to be a low potential for the drug to be abused. Generally recognized as effective, so again, these are qualitative statements, but they represent statistical analysis that studies have shown that this product is effective for treating the condition or disease that it is purported to treat. And this one is less of an issue now, but generally recognized as honestly labeled. And the reason it's less of an issue is because more recent legislation has defined labeling standards. So if you see here, this is just an example of drug label, but new regulations mean that these labels have to be standardized. So it lists the active ingredients, it lists the warnings, directions, how to use the drug, how often you can take it, what the inactive ingredients are. And so now all drugs have the same sort of label format, whereas before the information differed from one product to another, both in terms of what information was displayed and what order it was displayed in and what size the type was. So if you have bad eyesight, you couldn't read some of the labels. But there are now standards that everyone can read them, everyone can see what the active ingredients are, and so this is thought to be a safer approach, so everyone knows what to look for on these labels. So basically it makes it easier to compare between products, and this is particularly important for looking for those active ingredients. So as I mentioned, you can have multiple products that have the same ingredients, and the common practice, of course, is there are often generic versions of brand name medicines, but if you look at the active ingredients and they're exactly the same, it's going to be the same medicine. It's just marketed differently. Another standard that was introduced was using less technical terminology. So your book makes the example of saying lung instead of pulmonary, which is a medical term. Heart instead of cardiac. Uh, their blood vessels instead of circulatory system. All of these sort of medical terms have now been adjusted so that they're a little more accessible to the everyday person. So over-the-counter drugs are safe and effective and carry a low risk of overdose, but that doesn't mean they can't also be psychoactive. So we'll go over some of the psychoactive OTC drugs first. There are, of course, the stimulants, and these are mainly caffeine pills now. So amphetamines are available by prescription only. Obviously, there are a lot of Schedule 1, Schedule 2 substances that you can't obtain by prescription, things like cocaine, methamphetamine. So originally, there were products like phenylpropanolamine that were designed for weight loss. Later on, ephedrine came onto the market, again, for weight loss. But it turns out that these both had adverse effects, particularly cardiovascular effects. Ephedrine has been linked to higher incidence of stroke, for example. So eventually, these products were initially approved, and as evidence was built up, they started to get replaced. In many cases, these dangerous compounds are banned, or at least the warning is strengthened, or they're moved into a prescription-based modality. But the idea here is that even if a drug is initially approved for over-the-counter distribution, that as new research accumulates, that the status of these drugs can change. So phenylpropanolamine and ephedrine are no longer available like they were before. So stimulants are mainly caffeine pills now, things like NoDoz, Vivarin. And of course, the sedatives originally, and this is not that long ago, they would have an antihistamine, but also a compound like scopolamine, which is an acetylcholine antagonist. And scopolamine, of course, is also used questionably as things like a truth serum and as part of a cocktail for anesthetics. But it's no longer allowed in over-the-counter medications. And in fact, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, compounds like that, depressants that we've already talked about, are also not available over the counter. Those are available by prescription only because there's a decent risk of overdose. You can overdose certainly easily on barbiturates, a little bit harder on benzodiazepines, but it is possible. But you can also become dependent on them. So that means they're not really qualified as over-the-counter drugs. They are prescription-based. So really, sedatives, sleep aids, are, in their over-the-counter form, they're really just antihistamines. And that is the only active ingredient in sleep medications now, over-the-counter. Another big class of over-the-counter drugs are the analgesics. Of course, analgesics are medicines that are designed to alleviate pain. And here there are two kinds of pain. There's visceral pain, which is discomfort in the internal organs, the viscera. And this is mainly treated with opioids, or opiates. And we'll get into that next week. So that'll be our topic after Thanksgiving break. And of course, those are very effective, but they have a high risk of dependence and abuse. But for somatic pain, so that is pain in muscles or joints, a class of drugs usually called COX inhibitors treat that kind of pain. So the most famous, of course, is aspirin. There are two COX receptors, COX-1 and COX-2. The distinction is not important for us, but aspirin is a COX inhibitor. It is based on a compound called salicylic acid. Aspirin is actually a brand name that the Bayer company invented. So Bayer aspirin is actually a brand name, much as heroin was originally. Although obviously those two compounds have taken very different trajectories in our society. So salicylic acid is naturally found in the bark of the willow tree. and this has been known for hundreds or thousands of years. The ancient Greeks knew that willow bark could be used to treat pain. Uh, the thing is that salicylic acid, as it occurs naturally, is very irritating to the stomach. It's a gastric irritant. And so in the late 1800s, what the Bayer company did was they made a slight chemical modification. They took salicylic acid and put an acetyl group. Structure is not important for us, but they just made a small modification. And this still allowed the compound to be effective in terms of treating pain, but it was not nearly so irritating to the stomach. That actually made it easier to absorb, so it was actually more effective in the end um, because of this small chemical modification. And of course, aspirin does a variety of things. It relieves pain. It also reduces fever. It's what's called an antipyretic. So pyretic comes from the same root as pyromaniac, fire. So antipyretics reduce heat, reduce fever in this case. Also, they reduce inflammation, and they also reduce clotting. So they are blood thinners, which is why it's very popular, especially for older adults, to take what's often referred to as a baby aspirin. So a small dose of aspirin on a daily basis is thought to thin the blood um, and reduce the risk of clots. Of course, aspirin is not the only treatment for pain. It's not the only analgesic available over the counter. You also have acetaminophen, which is commonly branded as Tylenol. And this is a COX-2 inhibitor. Again, the one, the two don't really matter for our purposes. But acetaminophen is very effective at treating pain. It does have an unfortunate side effect that it is, in sufficient dosages, toxic to the liver, which is why you really need to be careful about how much Tylenol, how much acetaminophen you take in a given unit time. Those dosage recommendations are actually quite important in the case of acetaminophen. And of course, if you're on multiple medications that might all contain acetaminophen, then you have to be really careful. And then finally, there's ibuprofen, which is often, it's branded under a number of names, Advil perhaps being the most famous. It's also a COX inhibitor, and it is one of a class known as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, or NSAIDs. So you may have heard that on TV and commercials for medication, but NSAID pain relievers. So ibuprofen is one of these. But these all work via the same basic mechanism, the COX receptor, to treat somatic pain. And as I said, next time we will talk about visceral pain and the opioids. Okay, and the last category of popular over-the-counter drugs, obviously there are more than we're going to go into in this course, are the cold and allergy products. So first, colds, the common cold, they're caused by viruses. But it's not a single virus. There are rhinoviruses, rhino meaning nose, and coronaviruses. And there are lots of different kinds of these microorganisms. So which is why there's no cure for the common cold, is because the cold is caused by so many different organisms that no single drug is going to treat all of them. So really what cold remedies do is treat the symptoms. So they're not really remedies in its technical sense. They alleviate symptoms without actually addressing the underlying cause. You just have to wait out the viruses and wait for your immune system to get rid of them. So these medications usually contain multiple active ingredients, multiple drugs. One of them is usually an antihistamine, and this is to relieve the runny nose and sneezing, although recent evidence suggests that antihistamines may not actually be effective if the person has a cold. If they have allergies, they are effective. There's no question about that. But recent evidence has questioned whether there should be antihistamines in cold products because they may not work. There's usually also a sympathomimetic compound. Remember, this is the compound that activates the sympathetic nervous system. And this is there to reduce swelling. So remember, when our sympathetic nervous system is active, our heart rate goes up, our blood vessels constrict, and our blood pressure goes up as a result. And there are other effects as well, but it's really that vasoconstriction, that shrinking of the blood vessels, that justifies putting a sympathomimetic in a cold product because it reduces swelling, particularly in the nasal passages, which may be inflamed as a result of the cold and the runny nose and the sneezing. So this is to reduce that swelling. You also usually have an analgesic in there. So this is to treat the pain, the aches and pains, particularly headache. Um, and sometimes this analgesic is actually uh, acetaminophen. Sometimes it's actually caffeine for the headache. Remember our unit on caffeine. Caffeine can reduce the onset, can reduce the incidence of headache. Of course, caffeine is also a sympathomimetic. Um, but the analgesic is also in there as an antipyretic. So it reduces fever if the person has a fever. If you don't have a fever, antipyretics don't usually reduce your body temperature below normal. They only reduce body temperature if it's above normal. And then finally, many cold and allergy products have a cough suppressant, and that is usually dextromethorphan. So the thing about that compound is that in sufficient quantities, it has reported hallucinogenic effects. And this is why there's been an increase recently in the abuse of cough syrups that contain this compound, dextromethorphan, particularly in adolescents. The reports do not paint a very pleasant picture of this hallucinogenic experience, uh, but nevertheless, it has been reported that abuse of cough suppressant products is on the rise. Here is a table from your book, and this just shows some of the cold and allergy products and the combination of ingredients that they have. So here we see the sympathomimetic, antihistamine, analgesic, and cough suppressant compounds present in a couple of different products. So multiple active ingredients. Okay, that will do it for our unit on over-the-counter drugs. Next time, we will talk about opioids, which are another form of analgesic compound. They're, of course, derived from opium, which occurs naturally, so opioids have a long history. And we'll talk about how they work, what they do to the brain, what they do to the body. And we've mentioned opioids several times, particularly in our unit on drug regulation. And we'll go into more depth into what opioids do, how they work. And we'll also look at the regulations governing opioids and trends in usage. So who uses opioids? What are the risks for abuse? And so on. And so that will be next time, and I will see you then.